I'm sitting here at our office located in downtown Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, and after being a very dry summer, today is actually a very rainy, dreary Monday. So we've gotten quite a bit of precipitation already this morning, and it looks like it might continue into the afternoon and evening. So hopefully all that good moisture is soaking into the fields and doing some benefit to our crops that are still out there growing. So I know we have people that are listening from all over the country and all across the world. We really appreciate you being with us. And I'm sure that today's presentation will contain some advice that you can utilize wherever you are located and whatever growing conditions you might be experiencing this year. But it certainly has been interesting. It certainly has been dry in many parts of the country, and that's what we will address today in this Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar. So once again, would like to say hello and welcome to all of the listeners out there. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar. This presentation will focus on corn silage harvest. It's hard to believe, but it is that time of the year already. During this session, our speaker will lean on his agronomy and dairy training and experience to guide the audience through harvest management updates, considerations for challenged corn, and advice to help your farm optimize the silage potential for your herd. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF copy of the slides that can be printed or saved. That handout can be found in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. There you'll also find a document courtesy of our webinar sponsor, Lallemand Animal Nutrition, and we really thank them for their support of this particular webinar. If you have any questions that come to mind while the presentation is going on, please feel free to type them into the questions section of that control panel, and we'll address them following the presentation. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome John Gazer as our webinar presenter. John serves as the Animal Nutrition Director at Rock River Laboratory. He's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Animal and Dairy Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On top of that, he is also a dairy consultant for Cows Agree Consulting, LLC. John grew up in the dairy industry, following in his father's footsteps by pursuing a career in dairy nutrition. He earned a bachelor's and master's degree and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has training and experience in agronomy, plant breeding and genetics, forage management, and dairy nutrition. He has been in his role at Rock River Laboratory since 2012, overseeing animal nutrition, technical support, and research. Dr. Gazer, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation titled Optimizing Corn Harvest for Silage Under Variable Growing Conditions.
Thanks, Abby. To the Hordes Dairyman team, it's a pleasure to continue teaming up with you closely. I'm going to go on record with video in addition to audio here, so you can see my friendly face. I don't claim to be anywhere near as good looking as Professor Hutchins, but hopefully I can carry some of his energy, certainly his optimism, as we push forth and discuss how we can optimize the situation we find ourselves in today. I want to stress one point that Abby made earlier. Please bring your questions. We are farming in really unique times, to put it kind of simply. And your questions, I'd like to address them, and we can help steer the comment toward the back end of the presentation today. There's so many different ways that we could take our discussion. I'll do the best I can in rolling in and wrapping up some of the questions that have come across my desk and or my phone or in conversation over the last couple of weeks. But I recognize that the corn crop specifically from east to west coast in the United States and also internationally is very different, very unique this year. This fall will mark, do the math, 2008, so it's 15 years since I've been out of graduate school, and I can't recall a crop that we've experienced like this. So with that said, I'm optimistic. We'll get into that a little bit today as we talk through some of what I might project we might be experiencing. I was talking with a colleague before this session got going here today, maybe an hour ago, and I just asked him, hey, do you have any last words of advice with just this extreme heterogeneity and growing condition variability that we're farming with. And he said, hey, just portray that I'm every bit as accurate as the weathermen. So what I can commit to you all today is I am as accurate as your weathermen and women. So take that to heart, and that I feel like the weathermen and women set the bar pretty low for us with regards to accuracy. So hopefully I can step up a little bit beyond that. But let's have some fun. Let's get into the topic today and explore some different thoughts that hopefully we can take out and put into practice on your farm. So our agenda is we work through the next roughly 45 minutes and look to leave a good amount of time for questions and discussion. I'm optimistic that there are opportunities ahead, so that they're out there for us. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to spend a majority of our time discussing the 2023 season to date, some agronomic insights from a colleague and friend of mine, Todd Schomburg, as well as some others. We will need to spend a little bit of time revisiting our silage nutrition, so I'm not going to aim to make everybody expert nutritionists, but rather help us orient to a few numbers on our feed and forage reports that will, after we get through the crop, help us understand what do we have, how's this likely going to feed, and ultimately, as I mentioned, arm your dairy with some insights and strategies that you can put into practice on your farm with your harvesting crew to optimize what we're facing with our 2023 corn. And as I wade into this, I also want to acknowledge I've got a number of biases, and I'll put those right out in front. As Abby mentioned, my day job is working and overseeing nutrition with Rock River Laboratory, so certainly we'll have some insights from a feed testing perspective, and then have also done some consulting work with a number of different clients throughout the industry with my Calgary Consulting, Lalamont being one of those as well. So greatly appreciate the Lalamont Animal Nutrition team sponsoring the content today. And we certainly want to pay attention to aspects of the crop and do everything we can to preserve and efficiently to ferment our forage. And so Lalamont, among other folks within the industry, are certainly going to be helpful, not only with high quality products, but certainly with consultative expertise. So lean on those folks as we get into the season. So setting the stage for the optimism and the economic opportunity that I believe exists, I'm going to put this fairly dense slide in front of you all, and I appreciate Stacy Nichols sharing this content with me back in January and February, and then evolving and developing it a little bit further. And to lay out the format for you, you will notice a few slides that I'll present today that have a QR code nested within. So in this case, we've got a QR code on the top here. If you bring open your phone, your smartphone, and or some QR code reading device, just open your camera. This will take you to the reference behind this slide. So I hope this is efficient as opposed to sharing links within a slide deck. Just scan that and it'll take you to the story and or article behind this. But Stacy shared with me the results of a peer group effort that he and his colleagues at VitaPlus had conducted over the last, let's say 3 to 6 months. Hope my time frame is correct. And we looked at 40, 60 herds, something along those lines, and looked at differences in performance, et cetera. And it was a benchmarking survey. And I stressed to Stacy, look, Stacy, team up with me and help us understand what the highest output herds, these in theory highest performing herds, what is the input and what kind of economic opportunities may there exist for these high output herds? And I mean, this is right in line with some other discussions and threads. For example, I was talking with Ted Hallbach back and forth with a couple of emails yesterday with the North American Intercollegiate Dairy Challenge. Ted is doing some great work as part of the steering committee, but we were talking about benchmarking dairies and KPIs, and Ted had energy corrected milk, which is certainly an important metric. We've moved from total volume of milk to energy corrected milk, and that is more reflective of our pay price that we get paid at the end of the month. But I challenge Ted and I challenge us all to think about another KPI, key performance indicator, and one that perhaps is even more related to our economic performance, and it is feed conversion efficiency based on energy corrected milk. So taking into account not only the output, but also the input in terms of dry matter intake and feed. And that's really the point that I want to drive home here, speaking to economic opportunities. So Stacy presented me, and we looked at the top 20 herds shipping around 6.7 to 7 pounds of combined fat and protein. So these are high output herds. We are seeking to produce 7 pounds of components, and now 8 pounds is possible. My friend and colleague from college, Phil Finger Family Farms, he just let me know they hit 8 pounds of components, which is absolutely amazing. Perhaps that's a new goal. for us in the future. But even among these 7-pound excellent output herds, what I did and we did was we took a look at the dry matter intake, and this will relate to the topic at hand today, because forage, I believe, and our forage quality has a lot to do with this. But there was a range in 6 to 7 pounds of dry matter intake to produce roughly 7 pounds of components. That is a huge, huge spread to intake, and one that needs to be considered and we need to think about from an economic performance standpoint. So if we looked at, for example, maybe the bottom end of the curve or the top end of the curve, let's say we have a 4 to 5 pound difference that we could conceivably manage towards to produce that same hundredweight of energy corrected milk or 7 pounds of components. The difference associated with the dry matter intake and the inputs to get to the same 7 pounds represents 75 cents in margin opportunity. So this is at a high level, but even our highest output herds seemingly have quite a bit of range in terms of the dry matter intake and feed conversion efficiency. And this is something that is underlying as I work in my day job or look at the forage quality that I'm projecting us to have this year. What kind of levers can we pull, particularly from a forage and feed management and nutrition standpoint, that can get us down into the sub 60 pound dry matter intake range and still achieve this kind of output? So we will certainly probably continue to talk about volume of milk produced per cow, but I don't know that the US or the world needs a larger volume of work. Rather, we need to be working more toward efficiency. And based upon this data set, it appears that there is quite a bit of opportunity for us to continue chasing and pursuing efficiency within our dairies and nutrition program. So hopefully you've walked with me on that a little bit, and this is an exciting peer group set of data to delve into and for us to continue to understand what are the aspects of forage and feed and animal nutrition that will relate to us being in this 56, 58 pound range for dry matter intake. Let's talk a little bit about margin, more so from the market standpoint. And I continue to reference Mark Linsmeyer and the Margin Smart newsletter. There are many sources of great information. CIH, for example, does some great work in newsletters. I have taken a liking to Mark and his efforts because it's close to home, and we've carried some dialogue back and forth, and he's helped out with some insights, which we'll get to just in a minute. But let's reflect back on where we've been over the last 15 years and then project out what does the next 12 months look like. And I'm looking at this optimistically. So on the left-hand side, we've got net income before tax, with break even being right around this bold blue line here. And we can see the red line, which has been our realized based on mailbox prices and then expenses, where we've been. So we had very profitable times from mid to late 2021 through early 2023. And then the floor seemingly fell out. Unfortunately, pretty tough where we've not been able to cover our bills from just what we've been paid each month. So this has certainly meant a little bit of cutback in some of our approaches and maybe a little bit of a tightening of the belt, so to speak. As we project out the next 12 months, as of a month ago, we were projected to probably be in the neighborhood of $4, $5, $6 per hundredweight net losses for August, September. However, there's been some extreme bullish movement, meaning futures prices in class 3 milk in particular have raced up. Certainly corn and beans have moved around a little bit, and that is one important component to consider, understanding that they make up a majority of our feed costs. But we've seen some really strong and bullish movement. We're unfortunately not big and up in the black over the next projected 12 months. But as we look at Q3, Q4, and out in next year, at least we're closer to break even. And if we think about that 75 cents margin opportunity, maybe there are some things that we can do in managing our crop, which will help us uncover and unlock a little bit of margin, which will get us that break even or above. So I'm looking at this optimistically. And as I reached out to Mark Linsmeyer for some help in understanding this extreme positive movement we've seen in class 3 milk prices, I certainly, in my 15 years experience, couldn't wrap my head around what we were seeing, but Mark provided some great thoughts, which I wanted to pass along to you all, again, optimistically. So we unfortunately experienced pretty strong negative movement in milk prices. So Mark's comment to me was that this extended bearish movement, it was bound to rebound to some extent, or to rebound to some extent. We'd just gone too long with negative movement on the board over the, I would say, April, May, June time period when we bounced back up. But still, it was huge bounces to the point where the CME and others needed to raise trading limits for a few days just with the positive movement, which was outstanding to see. The analysts and projections have seen corn and bean futures bounce around, and these certainly are having an impact on dairy futures. So as we have projected, and the analysts have projected higher corn and bean prices, they're speculating, likely rightly so, that there is going to be a little bit maybe of cutback in feed costs or supplementation and less milk production. So that's one thing to bear in mind as we look at over the next month. If corn or beans move up or move down, that will have an impact on projected milk futures as well. A couple other factors that, and this made sense, but a couple other factors that played in that I didn't necessarily realize, and Mark commented, was that we've seen milk production increases year over year over the last few quarters, but the year over year increase in June was limited. So analysts looked at that and projected there might be a little bit of slowing down in milk production. And then also cattle inventory, in particular, replacement herd and beef cattle numbers have been down. So maybe cull cows are looking a bit better, and this may, as Mark put it, put a cap on our milk production in the foreseeable future. So these factors combined, there wasn't any one thing per Mark that really led to the run up, but as we look at projecting out, if anything, I think we might project to go a little bit higher. Now, again, think of me as a weatherman, right? I'm very apt to be wrong. The one thing that could happen that might push futures a little bit lower would be if all of a sudden our corn and bean prices soften quite a bit. Now, if we look at the crop report as of last week, the crop report came out to be projecting a little bit lower corn and bean yield. So that certainly would signal a little bit of an increase in corn and beans conceivably, but usage and carryout was a little bit lower to offset that. So not huge movement there, but pay attention to these in terms of inputs and then the impact that they may have on the milk production. And these are corn and beans are subject to the environment, the growing conditions that we're going to be talking about and diving into today. So as we look at projecting out what our 2023 feed quality is going to potentially be, I want to draw our attention to the fact that fiber content, fiber digestibility, starch, and starch digestibility really are big driving factors that I look to on our feed and forage report to project out forage quality. Particle size, fragility, thanks to Rick's work out at the Minor Institute, and then also UNDF, a very important measure, are certainly important relative to dairy cow responses in terms of both milk production, energy corrected milk, but also dry matter intake and eating behavior. These are important factors, but I'm largely going to focus on fiber and starch content in our discussion today, with thoughts around the growing conditions and where our fiber and starch and grain to stover ratios may land. Your nutritionists will do an excellent job in balancing nutrient content and nutrient digestibility, coming up with an estimate of what the total energy is in the feeds, and then balancing around that so that we can continue to put an optimal diet together, providing the necessary total digestible nutrient supply. But really, as we look at our complex forage reports, and again, I acknowledged my biases up front, so here's a Rock River Laboratory forage and feed analysis. There's a lot of numbers on this report, more numbers than any single nutrition software or nutritionist will use, but primarily we focus on the carbohydrates and carbohydrate digestibility. I like to look at some of the digestion numbers over time. I think one of the best numbers on a feed and forage analysis report to look at if you're working with Rock River Lab is a total track fiber digestibility. This was developed by Professor David Combs at the University of Wisconsin. Rock River licensed that technology. Some of my PhD work 15 plus years ago actually went into this. So again, another bias, but this total track fiber digestibility number has been helpful for us to predict responses following new crop years. So when we see numbers on this, regardless of the type of forage or feed, if we're in the 45 to 48 range, that feed is going to milk. If we're in the lower 40s, in the 30s, unfortunately, it's going to be pretty tough to get milk out of these forages. But here's the carrot out in front of us all. I think these TT&FD numbers are going to be looking pretty good this year. So I'll come back to some of the thoughts around why I think that's going to be the case east to west coast. And then back to the four numbers to look at: fiber content, starch content, fiber digestibility, that TT&FD number if you've got it, and then some estimate of rumen starch digestibility. These taken together collectively are going to represent 70 to 80% of the caloric value in your corn silage. So at this point, Randy Shaver and I work closely together. Milk 2006 was an excellent tool indexing forage. I think Milk 2006, as it sits today, is dead. So We don't necessarily look at that milk per ton or milk per acre value. Stay tuned. Professor Federico and his graduate student Cole Deepersloot are going to refresh that into the future, so I think that'll be helpful. But as far as today, just fiber and starch content, fiber and starch digestibility, these are the numbers that we want to look at and think about as we get some idea of what our crop quality is going to be. Resetting on where we were in 22, just to set the stage for 23. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, aside from documenting that our starch content, grain yield has been up, and our starch digestibility has been down. We've talked in numerous presentations, written in numerous articles about why this may have been. It's stemming from healthy plants, stay green technologies, a little bit more advanced kernel maturity. That's been the working hypothesis. Given the rainfall we've seen through some areas and the fact that I think we're going to have a little bit stronger ear fill than maybe we would have a couple of weeks ago prior to these rains, we may be talking about the same thing again, but let's get there in a little bit. All right, so I want to take a pause and offer an opportunity for you all to have an impact on where we go from here. But if we could pull open the poll here, and I'd look for some of your insight as to what has your farm experienced this year in terms of the conditions?
Great. So if you would like to participate, please pick one of the options up on the screen. What kind of weather conditions has your farm experienced this summer? Hot and dry conditions, average temperature but dry moisture-wise, average temperature and moisture, hot and wet conditions, or average temperature, wet conditions. If you pick one of those responses, looks like we have good participation right now. Going to give you just a few more seconds, and then I will close this poll. And John, I will just, let's see, share the answers with you here. So 30% said hot and dry conditions, 26% average temperature, dry conditions, 8% average for both temperature and moisture, 24% hot and wet, 12% average temperature, wet conditions. So looks like overall dry conditions have been experienced by the majority of our listeners, about half of them.
Thank you, Abby. And the amount of moisture, dry versus wet, is what I'm really going to key on today with regard to projecting the crop quality. There are a lot of different combinations with temperature and rainfall, but it's seeming that the moisture is really going to be more impactful in terms of forage quality as defined by fiber digestibility. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So as we transition from 22 to 23, thank you all for your insight into what your farm has been experiencing with regards to growing conditions. Change is hard, but we got this. We can come together and we're going to optimize. I promise you that this harvest for silage, it's going to be different, certainly going to be different, but let's embrace the opportunities at hand. Let's manage what we can and try and push off some of the anxiety, some of the thoughts, some of the concern with regards to the factors which are outside of our control. We can't turn the water on or off necessarily from a growing condition standpoint. Certainly those of you that have irrigation, it's a little bit different, but we can't necessarily influence the temperature, but we can influence what we do with this crop from here on out in terms of timing the harvest, managing cut length, kernel processing, and optimizing fermentation. So we got this. All right, so it sounded though as we had 60-ish, 70% that are experiencing hot or droughty conditions. So as of a few days ago, which this stands to flip, probably based upon the rainfall that some in the Midwest are getting over the last 36 hours, but pretty dry. So we've got, as we look at from east to west coast, a lot of cows in the New York, Pennsylvania region where at least on the growing season, we're not really in droughty conditions. As we look at the upper Midwest, the high plains, the central plains, it's been dry. It's been dry. So certainly having an impact on myself, my thought process, and what we're experiencing for crops. As we look at the Panhandle, where there's quite a few cattle, dairy cattle, and then out in California, certainly the Pacific Northwest has been a little bit drier, but 2023 has largely flipped the script. As I think about where we were last year, California and the Panhandle, decade of drought. I mean, just absolutely horrendous conditions from a moisture standpoint. Well, thanks to snowfall and earlier season rainfall in the mountains, and then in the Panhandle or West Texas, we've had a decent amount of moisture to replenish our reservoirs. So we're going to have different silage in these regions relative to what we had, say, in the decade prior. Conversely, in the upper Midwest, we had pretty good growing conditions in 21, 22. We ended up with decent yields, and then we had this profound high starch, low starch digestibility. This year it's going to look completely different. So let's wade through this a little bit, give you some idea of where we might land here in the next 2 to 4 weeks as we begin cutting corn for silage. So what I showed you on the prior slide was a crop year to date, just overall drought conditions. I also look at the precip map from the government website, NOAA, and we can manipulate and look at a number of different things. Here what I've done is looked at percentage of rainfall over the last 60 days. So we're to the point now where corn has tasseled, maybe not overly consistently, which we will talk a little bit about, but we have also recognized that the rainfall in the last 60 days is going to be important now for our pollination and for our grain fill. So our corn got up to a point where there's not a whole lot further we could do for it, but we're at this second critical stage of pollination and ear fill. And as of a few days ago, we were fairly dry where we're growing a lot of corn for silage in the Panhandle and out west, but we were going to be irrigating these crops, and now we're chopping pretty good corn out in California. The upper Midwest, I would have said as of 2 days ago, we're pretty dry. We could use a little bit of moisture. Well, that came, and as we look at the Northeast and New England area, tri-state region, we've had ample rain over the last 60 days. So I'm optimistic at this point, here I'm redundant in saying such, but we should have reasonable moisture for pollination and ear fill. Now that's not going to make the crop more consistent, but there's some potential there in that we've gotten some timely rains throughout a lot of regions. Certainly there's going to be some areas like southeastern Minnesota that maybe they haven't gotten some of these rains in the last 24, 36 hours, which are going to be perhaps pretty rough. But as I drive around the countryside, go and work with different producers, I think there's potential in this crop. The yields aren't going to be overly great for the most part in a lot of regions, but there's potential in this crop. Showing the 2023 season, and I'm going to use my backyard here in Wisconsin, just sort of as a microcosm for what I believe many of us are experiencing. And rather than the absolutes here, I'm just going to talk about the difference between the two sites. So in Arlington, this is southern Wisconsin, an hour and a half north in Marshfield, Wisconsin. Historically, these wouldn't be overly different if we looked at on the average. But what I want to point out here is that Arlington's been above average in terms of growing degree days, an hour and a half to the north, average for growing degree days. So a little bit of divergence here. More importantly though, and what many are experiencing east to west coast is, this is an hour and a half. Heck, I've had some producers tell me that one field versus another field, or one side of a field versus another side of a field, dramatic differences in precip and the amount of rainfall. Well, we certainly have seen that here as the black line indicates the precipitation deviation from the long-term average. Southern Wisconsin, well below average, at least until the weekend, and we've been somewhere 4 to 6 inches of rainfall, whereas central Wisconsin, right average. And so this is what I want to drive home. We have extremely heterogeneous growing conditions, even within farms, and that is going to be something that we are going to be dealing with in our harvest this year, and it's going to test us with regards to managing the crop. One aspect of our growing season, which at this point I don't know that we have a great handle on, nor will we. And Todd Schaumburg, to give him some credit from a webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago that I'll have a link to just in a minute. But we've also experienced, or many have experienced, smoke from wildfires in Canada. What might this do in terms of the heat and light intensity that our crops rely upon for photosynthesis? I don't know. This was a picture I took out at our cabin, which was a beautiful picturesque picture, but also you can see the smoke over the treetop and the sun coming up through. So that's something else that may, we can't necessarily test, but may have an impact on and likely has an impact on a lot of our growing crops, just limited light intensity, even with warmer days. So that's something that I at least want to make comments toward, not that I have an idea of how it's going to influence the crop, but certainly will be something from a growing condition. So let's begin talking about, and one overarching theme has been drier conditions, but as I was out in Pennsylvania with a group of seed consultants and seed advisors a few weeks ago giving a talk, they faced me with the challenge and said, hey, what about flooded corn? I thought, well, it's a little bit different than I would have perceived us getting into and talking about, but in the Northeast, we may have started the season dry, got our corn in the ground, but then all of a sudden had some flooding rains. And so I pulled this image off of the web just to make the point. But if we have flooding and or our corn flooded or excessive rainfall, excessive being maybe 2-3 inches of rainfall where the crop maybe couldn't utilize all of that, and it just washed through pretty quickly. One point that I'll make is if your crops experienced this type of rainfall it may and likely had an impact on fertility. So nitrogen in particular is quite mobile with water and rainfall. And so if your crops have experienced some rainfall like this and or flooding, don't be surprised if we've got a little bit lower crude protein crop, maybe a little bit lesser quality just due to that nitrogen in our fertility not taking hold and maybe just leaching and washing away. Another point to make is if we've had flooding when that corn was say V5, V7, or up around tasseling, and we had say up a foot to 2 feet on the stalk, probably have some ash considerations as well, just from soil sticking on the plant. So that's going to mean that there may be a little bit of interference in terms of our fermentation. So if your crop has flooded or experienced some flooding, talk with both your agronomist and whoever's helping you out from fermentation, and maybe talk about some considerations as far as managing this in and around harvest. Now getting to what I think will be a majority of our other growers out there. Let's start on the West Coast. So again, flipping the script on 2022, now 2023 in California, we've got a lot of dairies that are cutting corn for silage right now. I've been seeing pictures, getting questions from the West. We've had ample corn for the first time in a decade, even some flooding in some areas with some of the heavier rains earlier this year. But I'm changing and projecting very different yield and quality expectations this year in California. We're already starting to see some of this play out, as I've seen some pictures, starting to see some feed tests. We're seeing pretty good corn as far as yield, but I'm expecting the quality is going to be average to below average from a fiber and starch content, and then fiber digestibility, it will depend, and I'll explain what it will depend upon. We're seeing 25, 30% starch. So for those of you growing corn and harvesting out in California, putting up your dairies, don't be surprised if we see a little bit lower starch yield this year. And it's not necessarily lower grain yield, but back to the total yield, 30 ton. I think we've got some big old jungle corn because we've had ample water to irrigate our crop, maybe even put a little bit more to it just to drive those yields. But I think what that's doing is diluting out the grain. And so don't be surprised if we see a little bit lower starch content, perhaps coupled with a little bit better fiber digestibility, again, corresponding to when we put that water on, but perhaps a little bit lower starch content out west. Let's talk a little bit about the growing season impact in the first half of the year, and then the impact on fiber digestibility in addition to starch content. So thanks to Joe Lauer's work, and again, you can pull open your phone and camera and scan the QR code in the upper right-hand corner to go to Joe's blog post from last year. But thanks to Joe's work, where he summarized the first half of the growing season impact on the resulting forage yield and quality, I think we've got some pretty good insights with regards to heat or lack thereof, and moisture or lack thereof, and the resulting impact on starch content and fiber digestibility. So I've got 3 slides that are going to set up like this with bar charts. The first one is forage yield, tons of dry matter per acre. And so the scenarios we're going to look at are overall average yields, temperature, precipitation, average, cooler, warmer, or above and below, and then the extremes. What I'm seeing here in this slide is that it looks like precipitation, as we go from average to dry to overly wet, looks like it has negative impact on our yield. So for those of you that are farming in drier conditions, it shouldn't surprise you that we may end up with a little bit lesser yield in terms of total dry matter or total tonnage. But let's look at fiber digestibility, and this is really something that as a nutritionist and we've been seeking to understand and manage to the extent we can. As we've looked at temperature, it doesn't look like temperature, either cool or warm seasons, at least the first half of the season, and fiber digestibility is imprinted around the same time that the corn plant is imprinted with regards to the number of kernels around. So another thing that Schaumburg told me a couple of weeks ago is that our corn's been imprinted and it's been set, so we're not going to have necessarily the record numbers of kernels around the cob. Well, our fiber digestibility is set around that same time with it doesn't look like cool or warm temperatures influencing that overly much. But what we do recognize is drier years, we've got a little bit better fiber digestibility. Wetter years, and again, this is around V5 to V7, so that late June time period for many wetter years, lower fiber digestibility. Well, what have we expected what have we experienced this year? Largely been drier through the early parts of the growing season. So I think you can probably follow where my head's and thoughts are going with regards to fiber digestibility and this resulting crop this year. I think we've got some potential. If anything, I think it'll be up. So that's a good thing. In terms of extremes, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but really looking at the precipitation. I use now precip the first half of the year, around a little bit before tasseling, our precipitation is going to help us project out what the fiber quality, stover digestibility will be for our corn silage. So I think we're going to be trending pretty good. As we look at starch content, we see interaction with the temperature, cool and warm seasons above or below average, and then precip also having an impact. I think the dry, so this is starch content, just looking at our grain to stover ratio largely. The drier years, looks like we have higher starch content, which really wouldn't make sense if we were looking at this as an indication of grain yield. But I think what this is more so doing and suggesting is that we've got perhaps shorter plants and more grain relative to the stover. I think that's what we're experiencing to a T this year. As I've driven hundreds and thousands of miles, and I look at corn in the areas and regions I've been driving, generally we have short statured corn. Drier starts of the year, that corn just didn't grow with the momentum maybe that it did out west, where we just put a lot of water to it. So we're gonna have shorter corn. But if the last couple of weeks and the moisture we've had, if we put a reasonable or even a little bit bigger than I would have expected ear on, I'm expecting also we're gonna have pretty high starch content. So we could have high starch content with a higher grain to stover ratio, higher fiber digestibility. That's really, really good. That's gonna be fantastic from a milk per ton standpoint and looking at energy per pound. So we may not have the biggest yields on a per acre basis, but if we look at the punch that those acres are going to give us in terms of energy per pound or per ton, I'm thinking that we could have pretty good feeding corn silage as we get into our 2023. So start to think about, all right, well, if we have higher quality corn silage this year, what might we want to do a little bit differently? We can get to that. Unfortunately, with the average comes the realization that there's a pretty wide spread around the average. So on average, I'm projecting pretty decent quality in terms of fiber digestibility and starch content. But one thing we're going to be faced with and challenged with this year is a wide spread to our quality. So this picture I took just outside of home for me, and I believe is indicative of what we're faced with. So this is a hybrid grown in a pretty good field. Pretty good grower here, but we can see half the field's tasseled, half the field's not. This is our growing season impact, and I know this is the case all over the place. This was, Todd and I got into this discussion pretty heavily a couple of weeks ago in a PDPW dairy signal. If you want to reflect back on that content and listen to some of Todd's thoughts from a consulting agronomist standpoint, please do. He's going to have better thoughts than I do, as I'm just a pretend agronomist. But what I appreciated a couple of pictures from Todd that I will bring forth here in this slide. So Todd shared this with me. He consults and is co-owner with Tilth Agronomy, so to give him credit. But we not only have widespread to our pollination this year, we had widespread to our germination before that. So here in this bottom center picture, for example, this is corn planted at the same time, but we can see clear differences in germination. So as we sit today, our crop, for example, that may look like this, we may not recognize some of the heterogeneity in pollination, or rather in germination and subsequent pollination, but it is there, and it will be tougher for us to manage in terms of timing. How do we decide to when to go in our fields? Should we start? Should we wait? Do we potentially side with earlier or later corn silage? Here's what I'll pass along, and this is a take-home point this year, and I'll give Ev Thomas a little bit of credit. He discussed this in the latest Minor Institute Farm Report. He stated, and I agree wholeheartedly, that we need to chop our corn for silage based upon actual dry matter. Do some tests, get out, chop, and make sure we have a good understanding of where our whole plant dry matter is at. And don't use one field as a signal, but rather we're probably going to need to be a little bit more, I would say, all-encompassing, or sample more fields and even more spots within a field to have an understanding of where our acres are really at for silage. This is as wide of a spread to corn state as I can recall, and Todd could recall. And so I think it warrants spending a little bit more time and just documenting and scouting, working with your agronomist and other growers perhaps as well. Make an effort to understand where your crop is at with regards to physiological maturity right now. And also, hopefully you've noted tasseling date. And what Todd had commented to me was that not only average tasseling date, but the time your corn first tasseled and then the date that your corn last tasseled, and use that information to help you time when you get out in walk fields and begin checking whole plant dry matter. So ultimately, we are going to time our harvest based upon whole plant dry matter, but it's going to be a wide range this year. We're probably going to have fields that are nowhere close, and we're going to probably have fields that are maybe a little bit overly mature. What I'll tell you here is avoid getting into fields too early. So if you're worried about having some later fields, I think that is going to be something we're just going to deal with this year. What I don't want to see is us getting into and chopping immature corn and or where the corn didn't develop as far as it should have. We want to target that 65% full plant moisture on the pile or in the silo on average. If it's super spread out and we have fields that are just nowhere close, we may opt to maybe split our forage into 2 different silos or split into 2 different piles. We may need to think outside the box, but it's going to start with walking fields and understanding where the corn is at. Do not visually assess the corn. Do not just do drive-bys. Get out and walk your crop, recognizing that what we see here from a month ago is absolutely playing out with regards to progression toward physiological maturity. So be aggressive this year, or spend a little bit more time walking fields. It will pay off for us. So noting those tasseling dates that I commented to before, so we're going to use our average tasseling date. So hopefully you've marked that down on your calendar. If you did not, talk to your agronomist, talk to your neighbors as to when their corn was tasseling. I was projecting that based on when I first started seeing corn tassel a little while ago, we would be chopping corn into August. Well, heck, there were still crop dusting planes and helicopters getting out, and what I assume to be applying fungicide as of the last week or two, which means we still have corn that's been tasseling over the last couple of weeks. So I'm expecting we're gonna have a pretty wide harvest window, but start walking your fields 40 to 45 days, 40 days probably after that average tassel date, but recognizing that we might not be chopping until 60 days after tasseling, just with the wide spread. We are going to want to make our decision based upon whole plant moisture, but also take note of kernel maturity and that cob progression in the fields, and also plant health. I'm expecting we're going to have pretty good plant health, leaning on some of what Damon Smith has told me as a plant pathologist. Really haven't had issues or haven't had conditions for ear and stalk rot to come in. We'll see what these heavier rainfalls, if that changes things from an ear rot standpoint, but take note of kernel maturity and plant health, and these may be factors or we may observe things in these spaces that may steer us a little bit differently at harvest. Coming to some of the questions that have been kicked my direction over the last week or two. So hailed on corn, what should we do here? There have been some isolated hail situations or fields that have been hit with hail. My first comment is going to be talk to your agronomist. Does the corn plant, is it completely destroyed such as we see here where the crop is going to be near total loss? Or is it a situation where we just have some, maybe it was lighter corn and we have some tattered leaves that maybe there's a concern for a little bit of ear rot or fungus to come in, or plant disease, but can the plant come through it? If the plant can come through it, if there's still some potential for growth and adding additional dry matter and tonnage in that field, let it go. If it's been destroyed, like you see here in this picture, well, we're going to have to think outside the box and probably go and treat that like a sorghum silage, perhaps direct cut it and or mow it and try and wilt it down a little bit, and keep this feed separate. Keep this feed separate. For those that have not been blessed with any rainfall, and we're now talking about harvesting extreme drought-stressed corn. Now we can always tell based upon the ear leaf if the plant is alive or not. And so if that ear leaf is green, that's the plant, the leaf adjacent to the ear. If that's still green, I would advocate to, hey, just let that plant go and hope for a little bit of rain. But if we get to a point where our agronomist in the field is just done, it's cooked, we can do a couple of different things, such as direct chop or mow it and lay it down. There's even some folks feeding beef cattle talking about baling corn. I don't know that I would advise that because I think we might come in with a little bit more soil contamination in addition to a stressed crop. But one thing we will realize in those situations are potential for nitrate toxicity. So yet another reason why I think we would want to ferment our crop. I will advocate across the board this year for using a research-backed forage inoculant. There's so much that it's outside of our control, but if we at least put 1 or 2 grams per ton on of a research-backed bacterial inoculant, I believe that is a great investment toward optimizing our fermentation efficiency. But for our drought-stressed corn, we will want to test for nitrates before we feed that silage back out. Fermentation can clean up nitrates. Nitrates will localize in the bottom portion of the stalk, so if we can chop a little bit higher with drought stress corn, that may help, but we're probably not going to want to leave any yield out in the field. Aspergillus and aflatoxin, that may be something of concern as well, especially if there's an ear that comes on with a little bit of grain. And like I mentioned before, fermenting these extremely stressed corn crops for silage is going to be one thing that is underneath our control or within our control. So bacterial inoculant, exceptional packing density, chop length, kernel processing will depend upon the type of corn that we're chopping. Cut height, like I mentioned, for drought stressed corn, probably not going to be anything that we're going to do a lot with, but for our growers out west or where we've had irrigation and or out east where we have pretty normal or above average growing conditions where we do have some height to our corn, we should be talking about perhaps raising the cutter bar up. I think back to Mark Lair, he passed this along to me and he said, hey, if I'm going to chop the bottom foot of the stalk, for example, and recognizing that bottom foot of the stalk is heavily lignified, not digestible, why would I pay to chop that, pay to pack it the bunker, pay to put it in the diet, and then when the cows don't digest it, it ends up in the manure, and then pay to put it back out on the field? I think that concept and that story makes sense. Luis put a little bit of research behind this, summarizing some of the papers that have been published out there. And what Luis observed, and I think we can take to the bank, is that for each 10-inch increase in cutting height, we can expect, yes, a little bit of different yield, a little bit of less yield, but if we've got super tall corn, maybe yield isn't our primary concern. An increase in starch content because we've got more grain and a little bit less stover, so 2 inches or 2% gain in starch. We also see an increase in fiber digestibility because there's less of that tree bark, there's less of that lignin in that silage. So if we're farming out in California, or if we're farming again in other areas where we've got pretty tall corn, say 10, 12, 14 foot tall corn, I think we should be talking about and looking at raising the cutter bar height at least 10, 15 inches perhaps, and that may help us, or certainly will help us in terms of energy value per ton. When I looked at a normal cut height versus a high cut height, just to put some cash flow projection numbers together, or numbers that'll help us in cash flow projections, I'm speculating that with an increasing cut height of say 10 inches, we may get another pound or two of milk production per cow per day when we feed the same amount of silage. And that comes from the increase in fiber digestibility and the increase in starch content, just a little bit more energy value per pound of feed consumed. So some numbers that may help you if you are one of the, I would say, less than the majority that have these have this type of corn and can discuss this. I certainly think it warrants discussion. Regardless of what our corn looks like this year, kernel processing is also within our control. And so historically, we've been looking at, say, 60 to 70% KPS has been a desirable goal. This benchmark is changing. So for those of you that have worked alongside me, you know that I'm aggressive in pushing the envelope. And I think, I've certainly faced some challenges as far as my thought process. But one thing I know we can do and know we can manage is hitting 75 to 80% kernel processing score. So that old 60, 65 to 70% is no longer good enough. The best are hitting 75 to 80% KPS. The Western US is actually pacing the race here, as they've been on average averaging about 75%, and the upper 15th percentiles hit 80%. But these benchmarks correspond to, of all the samples analyzed by Rock River Laboratory, for example, the top 15% of samples that hit the laboratory are in that 75 plus neighborhood. Now, that is for fermented silage, and we know that fermentation will increase kernel processing score. So if you're going to check your KP, your kernel processing during harvest this year, subtract 5 to 10 units off of that, because that fermentation will increase at 5 to 10 units. And so a realistic goal is 65 to 70% kernel processing when measured through the laboratory with green chopped silage. So this is going to be important on the whole, on average. And it also is going to be exceedingly important for these fields that are a little bit more mature. Like I mentioned before, we're going to have a wide spread for many of you in terms of our plant physiology and our condition when we're going out in the field and harvest. So at 65% whole plant moisture, if 21 and 22 are any indication, we're probably going to have 2/3 milk line. And for those fields that are a little bit more mature, say 3/4 to closer to black layer, this kernel processing is exceedingly important. So I do not want to see us go into fields when the corn is too wet just to maybe have it a little bit easier from a kernel processing standpoint. I believe what we are going to give up in terms of starch accumulation and also the potential losses in leachate and just seeping and also the negative aspects of fermentation with wet corn. I don't want to see us average 32%, 30% dry matter in the silo. I want to see us average 35% in the silo, but that's probably going to mean we're going to have a little bit more mature fields, and this kernel processing is really important to nail down this year, especially if we have 5.5, 6.5. Hopefully we don't see $7 per bushel corn, but we need to do everything we can to optimize starch digestibility. Kernel processing is under our control. One other comment I want to make, and this comes from experience out of the 2022 growing season, where we've seen perhaps a little bit increase in frequency from piles collapsing and or splitting. So these are a couple different corn silage piles that I've been pulled in on for support, upper left-hand corner, a few hundred tons falling off this corn silage. This is a very well-managed dairy, very well managed, very high feed quality, exceptional feed quality. Their pack density is incredible. And this wasn't the seam, it just fell off. Another situation where we had a similar situation, another few hundred ton of feed. And then I had another nutritionist a little bit further south. This is a beef herd, as you can see, or you could speculate given that there's not a cover on the pile, but just slid off. This wasn't a seam between new crops, but the corn silage separated. What I think this might be due to, and where this might impact our management in 2023, I think the higher quality fiber corresponding to healthier plants, green plants, stay green technology top to bottom. We've been harvesting and managing this corn like we historically have, but I'm wondering if it doesn't make sense if we've got green corn top to bottom, but we're at 65% whole plant moisture, perhaps our kernel maturity is a little bit more advanced, soaking up some of that moisture. It might make sense to chop our corn a little bit longer. I believe some of what we're seeing here may be due to just more digestible fiber and a little bit less physical integrity to the fiber corresponding to healthier, more digestible stalk and stover. So in the rumen, more digestible fiber, healthier plant is certainly a good thing, but in the pile, perhaps we need a little bit more length, maybe a little bit more physical structure. So if your dairy has experienced some of these cave-ins or silage coming apart this year, talk about cut length and consider widening out your cut length a little bit longer. Now that's going to come at the expense of kernel processing, because kernel processing and cut length certainly play off one another, but these are discussions that we may need to have if your dairy has experienced these types of phenomena, because we certainly don't want to be feeding through say a few hundred ton of corn silage that's fallen off a pile. We have some aerobic stability issues perhaps to contend with. We also have safety issues, more importantly, to contend with. So another unique aspect to perhaps new age silage that we haven't been dealing with historically in the past. So as I get close to the finish line here, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but after we get through this season, hopefully safely, successfully, we're proud of what we got done. As we look at feeding out 2023 silage, I think back to what Mike DeGroat commented as he was talking about feeding 2022 corn silage in California. As he was lamenting, it was as widely and variable and heterogeneous as anything he'd ever experienced, and that was after dealing with prolonged and extended drought, very expensive water. Some fields got irrigation, some didn't. He said, you know what, John, I've never experienced anything like this. I think we're going to be dealing with that now in the Midwest through the Northeast, just wide-ranging quality within our pits, within our piles, within our bunkers, and our silos. So as we think about feeding this silage, I want to think about understanding our nutritional value and even our moisture like we do when we're sighting in a rifle. So I'll leave us with this anecdote as I wrap up. When we sight in our rifles, and you see another shameless plug in here for my friends and colleagues in Vortex Optics within Wisconsin. I love those guys, but I think it makes some sense here as we talk about perhaps a new optic on a rifle. When we sit down on a bench, and I was doing this with my kids over the weekend, and we try to determine, is our rifle scope zeroed in or not? So here's the situation, the first situation. We take one shot, and I pose the question, is this optic sighted in or not? I think experience, those of you that had sighted in rifles with new optics, new scopes mounted, you recognize, well, we can't make a decision based upon one single shot. If I analogize that to animal nutrition and even our moisture testing, how much weight do we place based upon one sample, whether it be a sample of silage that we run through a microwave or a coster or an on-farm NIR or the laboratory for moisture, or a sample that we test and our nutritionist tests, and then we utilize that information in terms of formulation. Think about it like this case. When we shoot our rifle, we take 3 5-shot groups, then we average that to understanding we average that to understand what adjustments we need to make in terms of our zeroing of that scope on that rifle. Animal nutrition is the same. I could speak for another hour on some experiences as of late, detailing that, hey, there's quite a bit more happening within our feeds, on our dairies, within our silos. Yes, corn silage is a bit more consistent crop than hay or haylage. However, especially this year, our corn silage is going to be more heterogeneous than we have experienced in quite some time. So work with your nutritionist and consider some approach to averaging the last 2 or 3 observations and utilizing, say, a 3 to 5 shot group in your decision-making process, whether it be adjusting moistures or whether it be adjusting your diet. And that information needs to come from a meaningful period of time, meaning that's what the cows have experienced. So I would say over a 1 week to 2 or 3 week period of time, we need 2 to 3 observations in that period of time to move our decisions. So hopefully that point resonates with you all as we think about after the fact, after we get this corn in silos. I'll put up my contact information here and we'll open the floor for questions. I look forward to some of the discussion. Here's another QR code out in front of you. I've had the opportunity to support a local foundation, or not somewhat of a local foundation in Oscar Mike, but if you'd like to know anything more about this organization, hopefully Abby and team don't mind the shameless plug for this nonprofit organization supporting catastrophically wounded veterans in Oscar Mike. But these people were incredible to go out and interact and meet with them, and they empower me, they motivate me to continue on in my day job to do the best that I can. And so hopefully you don't mind me putting that plug in for that organization. But beyond that, it's about family. As you can see here, my son, Sam, and Lucy, and my wife, Katie. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on the socials at John Gazer, or by mobile phone is as well. I'm here to bring support to the extent I can in conjunction with Abby and the Hordes Dairyman team. Thank you for the opportunity today. I look forward to question and discussions.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing all this information today on corn silage harvest, and then a little bit of like some personal information in this great organization as well. So we appreciate getting to know you a little bit better through your presentation. I do have some questions here. First, I want to once again, if you could move the slide, thank you very much. Thank Lalaman Animal Nutrition for sponsoring this webinar. If you want to learn more about them, please check them out online, or again, there is a handout that you can click on in that handout section. Also, I want to remind you that all of our webinars are available online on our archive. So later this week, you'll be able to find Dr. Gazer's presentation, as well as all our other webinars that have been created throughout the year. So you can find that on our website, hordes.com, on our webinars tab. I also want to invite you to our upcoming presentations. We hold our webinars the second Monday of the month, all through the year. And in September, we'll have a presentation on maximizing milk quality while minimizing mastitis, presented by Pam Rug of Michigan State University. And then in October, we'll have Bob James, a professor emeritus from Virginia Tech and now a dairy consultant, and he'll be talking about feeding and raising today's dairy calf. So if those topics interest you, I really hope that you will make plans to join us for one or both of those webinars. Now, we did have some questions that came in, so I will just dive into these. And John, you did a really great job. A few questions that we have, I think you already answered through your presentation. So you were, thinking ahead to what people might be wondering about. So I won't do those particular questions again, but the first one here is a little more of a general question, but it says, what steps do you recommend to ensure we optimize available starch consistently, regardless of the different growing conditions?
Oh, it's a good question. It's going to be dependent upon what we end up with. And as we sit today, I've got some ideas on where we're going to go. Let's hypothesize that we have above average starch contents. We got pretty high starch silage, meaning there's quite a bit of grain relative to the stover. Hopefully we've got a reasonable amount of carryover from 2022. So fermentation is going to be one of the biggest factors, along with kernel processing, that will optimize and increase the starch digestibility. So those two factors, certainly the growing season, seed genetics, and maturity. So we will be able to manage maturity, but I think we're going to, by targeting 65% whole plant moisture, that's where we want to be. The kernel maturity is going to land wherever it's going to land. So we want to stay on top of kernel processing, and then ferment this corn and aggressively ferment this corn. So I hit on what value a bacterial inoculant may have, but optimizing fermentation, accelerating and speeding that up to the extent we can is going to help us improve starch digestibility and help us get more bang for our buck. As I looked back at 21 and 22 silage, 2020 corn silage fed to its full potential in about 3 months, but then 21 and 22, it took 6 to 9 months for that corn silage to feed to its full potential. And I think, again, that was due to a little bit more advanced kernel maturity, increasing plant health. So we had green plants top to bottom, and we just had drier grain soaking up some of the moisture from the stalk to get us to that 65%. If we assume that 23 is going to be like 21 and 22, it's back to kernel processing and then doing what we can to ferment that crop as soon as possible. We're not going to be able to change necessarily that kernel maturity, but we want to blow those kernels up and ferment it aggressively. And I think a bacterial inoculant is certainly something that can help us in that regard. Is that going to improve starch digestibility relative to an uninoculated? I don't know, possibly, but it would certainly, this year would be the year to go after it.
Thank you for that insight. Next question, considering pricing, crop quality, and projected milk production, how important do you still think feed efficiency is going to be? And said another way, what do you think is more important, high dry matter intake or high feed efficiency, considering the good crops or a good crop year? Maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, appreciate the engagement, and it's an efficiency game. We all get paid for 100 weight of milk, and those dairies that produce that 100 weight of milk more efficiently are going to win out long term, and that may be something to do with herd size in terms of buying power, but there's a lot, as I showed with that data from Stacy and that peer group, there's a lot of range to our high output herds. So we want to be optimizing and pushing for higher and higher feed conversion efficiency. And that may not be necessarily more volume of milk, but that's okay because we're expanding our margins and we're expanding and padding our pocketbook by lessening the input and the cost side of the profit and loss statement. So I want to see us increasingly push for feed efficiency. One thing that we didn't talk about at all today, but it's certainly been a very hot topic, has been sustainability. Well, pushing for feed efficiency is going to increase our margins, increase our profitability, but it will also increase our sustainability because the more carbon that we put into meat and milk in terms of butter fat and nitrogen and protein, the less we're going to have in nitrogenous and methane and carbon emissions. So I think that's yet another reason to be pushing for feed conversion efficiency because that also directly ties to methane and sustainability, which is something that we absolutely have to be on board with and speaking to the sustainable efforts that we're putting into practice on our farms.
All right. Do you know of any models or tools that are available to support farmers in predicting milk line progression and or ideal harvest time based on hybrid climate, the area's climate and weather conditions? Anything like that out there?
There's a couple of GDD tools I've used in the past, growing degree day tools, and so corn is pretty well bred to tassel and then reach physiological maturity after tasseling. So if we know our planting date and our relative maturity, there's a website, and I'm not going to have these readily available, but there's a website from Cornell, and I think Joe Lawrence maybe would be someone to reference to try and find that. And then there's been one in the United States, I think from University of Illinois, maybe Missouri, where we can put in our planting date, our relative maturity, and then look at projected silking, tasseling, black layer relative to growing degree days and historical norms. So there certainly are website tools out there that will help us project out if we know our planting date and relative maturity. There are a couple of tools out there, I know for a fact. Maybe reach out to me after the fact and I can help you find those as well, or we can work with Abby and the Hordes team to get those websites posted.
All right, thank you for that. Next question. What about the effects of growing condition stress on protein digestibility?
So protein isn't our main concern with corn silage. I'm just going to say that up front. So there is crude protein in our corn silage, but in general, I actually don't want to see high protein corn silage because that often trends with a little bit higher prolamine and hardness in the grain and less digestible starch. So protein comes along for the ride, but is not a focal point with corn silage. And I frankly don't want to see high protein corn silage unless we end up with a drought corn silage, which just has a bunch of protein because it's growing like a big grass. So as far as protein digestibility, I don't know within the stover that I'm going to have any great insights. Within the grain, it's going to correlate to starch digestibility. So if we have, say, a high amount of protein in our grain and in the endosperm, and that corresponds to a high amount of Zane protein, that protein matrix that surrounds the starch granules, and corresponds to harder grain, in theory, that higher protein would indeed be less digestible. But really, carbohydrates are the focus with corn silage. As I showed earlier, 70 to 80% of the caloric value is coming from fiber and starch and their respective digestibility. So more importantly, the protein in the diet, and milk protein, for example, is going to be more influenced by the carbohydrate nutrition and digestion associated with corn silage than it will be by the actual protein supplied by corn silage.
All right, next question. What is your advice for harvesting wind damaged corn? And they explain this, the corn was not flattened, but it was severely lodged and also received a little bit of hail damage.
Okay, so it sounds like that corn's been goosenecked. So we have green snap and then goosenecked. If we've got green snapped corn, broke off, dead, done, we need to treat it like a hay crop. But in the event that we've got goosenecked corn, corn's pretty resilient about coming back up. So if it's been hailed as well, that it's been dealt a double whammy, so to speak, first consult with your agronomist and get some idea of, all right, how badly damaged is this corn? But ideally, I would want to let the corn go to the extent that we can, because goosenecked corn, it's surprising how much it'll come back up in terms of just rebounding. And then the little bit of hail damage, if we just have a little bit of leaf damage, it's surprising how resilient, again, that corn is. So I would say let the corn go. It's going to be a little bit difficult probably to get through and cut it. We might need to cut in one direction with a Kemper head when we go out and chop that corn, but I would say let it go and manage it alongside the other acres.
You talked quite a bit about harvest timing. A question here, because of drought conditions, would you say it's a good idea to harvest the corn silage early and take advantage of the soluble fiber instead of waiting for more starch to develop as an energy source?
Nope. So especially with some of the rains that we're starting to see, if that ear leaf is still green, that plant still has potential in life. So if it gets a shot of rainfall and moisture, and I think back to 2012, so I was a couple of years out of graduate school at that point, and severe drought in the upper Midwest, and folks were starting to panic a little bit and maybe running into fields and chopping a little bit premature. But if that ear leaf, that leaf right underneath the ear is still green, has some green to it, that plant is still alive. And Joe Lauer taught me this, and it was one of the things that I remember. My memory's horrible, but if that ear leaf is still green, let that plant go, and hopefully in hopes that we get a little bit of rainfall, a little bit moisture, so that we can accumulate some more dry matter yield, some more tonnage. In the event that we are able to start putting down an ear, in no way, shape, or form do I want to be talking about or considering cutting that corn early. Again, even if we didn't have any more ear come along, but that we just had a really wet crop, I don't think there's any advantage to harvesting it now as opposed to letting it go a little bit further. If we find ourselves with corn that is barren and there's no ear whatsoever, well, then that's a different scenario. We may have to treat that like sorghum, and maybe we do have to wilt it. I don't know that we want to wait for a freeze because that's a long ways from now, but I don't want to see us getting into fields prematurely. I think that's been an area where we could have done better in the past. So let the corn go, stay in active communications with your agronomist.
Excellent. Thank you for answering these questions, John. I think we've gotten through everything that we have on hand right now. Again, John offered up his contact information, so if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to him, or you can reach out to us at Hordes Dairymen and we can help you get those questions answered. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Gazer for sharing the information today on harvesting corn silage. I'd also like to thank my teammates for helping put together this webinar production. And then last but not least, I want to thank all of you who are listening out there. We are really thankful that you take time to join us. We know you all have busy schedules and a lot of different responsibilities, but we hope that these webinars are informational for you and they help you make better decisions on your dairy or with the dairies that you work with. So until next time, goodbye from all of us here at Horde's Dairyman, and we hope to see you on a future webinar.